if I understood correctly, Edith was presenting an argument against, well, no, against is the wrong term, but problematizing nationalism as, nationalism, which I think we should all be on, let's agree on that nationalism is the opposite of modernism here. I mean, that's what you said, and I would agree with that. We could take this up with everybody else, but I would present, regionalism as opposite to modernism, and we could debate why. So the argument here was that what's happening in your context of Hungary is that there's a government that, since you work for a state museum, is calling for a nationalist exhibition, nationalist programming. May I add a very right-wing government. I hope we all agree on that too. On the other hand, it's an argument that is very, it's interesting because I expected to hear, and I guess I'm going to do this, or am I? Making a defense of the national trajectory. Because Doryun's argument, as I understood it, was that, and as you presented it, was that it's, after all, it is a global museum that you're working with. The title what was the? I mean, a museum with a global vision. Here, it was interesting when seeing the works that you presented, how they are works and artists producing works that are very much in various different trajectories of the familiar trajectory, namely the trajectory in this museum, or in the canonical modernist trajectory, and so one is tracking when artists in that context were connecting with it and also revealing just how difficult it was and how late it was. That's why I think you called it juvenilia, right? I mean, it was like late. I mean, if the 1970s, they're making Fauvist-like paintings. We have to discuss this. I mean,
They were also young, too.
They're also young, okay. But, or you could tell, if you want, we could just call it for what it is. I mean, in the 1990s, everybody turned to pop art. They weren't young. I mean, they were like, what was it that all of a sudden Warhol was the cutting edge of an artistic avant-garde, if you want to refer to it as that. The point here, though, is that it's also not an alternative narrative story, right, to the one that we're familiar with. It's one that is talking about different clocks, but connecting to the mainstream narrative. So either rejecting from the government perspective or connecting. I mean, we can think of plenty of, okay, I will talk from the Latin American perspective then. Plenty of, I'm more comfortable speaking about scholarship than I am about museum practices because of my own background. But there are plenty of studies that are being carried out that are attempting to make arguments for the primacy of the national trajectory and how, take Brazil, for instance, how those developments that we see in, say, what we're most familiar with in the 1960s, say, with neo-concretism of Ligia Clark, how they are not connected necessarily to that narrative, or not so neatly connected to the narrative that we're familiar with, but in fact go back to developments in the 1910s and 20s in Brazil that were problematizing modernism, then go back to all the way back to Montaigne, and people were talking about the cannibalist dimension of that part of the world, and how there's a trajectory that is a separate trajectory altogether, and the scholarship that I'm referring to will then claim that any attempt to read, say, Ligia Clark through the lens of the narrative that MoMA is telling is actually a violence of sort, and it's certainly wrong. It's wrong, factually wrong, and it's yet one more colonialist or one more imperialist imposition on an different, an alternate culture. You know, that's a third position that we can bring forward here, and I think that's one that we need to, I'll represent it. I'm not sure. I'm talking about other people's scholarship, so I can cut it both ways. I can have it both ways here. It will deflect off of me inevitably, but the idea here would be, the question here would be, to Doryun say, why not construct a narrative of Chinese art that is based on Chinese art? Contemporary Chinese art that is grounded not on number one, the inability to connect with the canonical narrative, and number two, the sputtering attempts to make that connection. So why not talk about contemporary Chinese art, or talk about the narrative of Chinese art that you're going to construct by looking at the very peculiar nature of that production, based on the history that that led to its production in the first place. So these are questions, and I hope we can come back to this. What I did want to do, because I guess I'm more literal. I'm sorry, Christian. I did take the questions literally. So when you ask this question of is there such a thing as a global museum? Whoever asked it, I thought about it, and of course, we could spend a whole semester on this question, but it came to mind that there really isn't a language for a global museum. Perhaps it's being constructed, but there is a language for a universal museum. And I think that if we're willing to couple global and universal, we actually have a treatise that we can go back to begin to answer this question. If you're comfortable in coupling universal and global. And the treatise that I'm referring to is the Declaration on the Importance and Value of Museums, which was drafted in 2002, and it was signed by the directors of 19 major Western institutions, including MoMA, right? The Met, the Guggenheim, Whitney, the Louvre. There are 19 major institutions wrote this treatise about the Universal Museum. And let's take a few sentences here, a few of the key sentences as they relate to our question. Today, the text explains, and I'm quoting here, we are especially sensitive to the subject of a work's original context, the national, regional, local context, China, Hungary, but we should not lose sight of the fact that museums too provide a valid and valuable context for objects. In other words, museums are also contexts that have their own conventions and traditions and norms, the way that national, regional, and local contexts do. Although each case has to be judged individually, we should acknowledge that museums serve not just the citizens of one nation, but the people of every nation. Therefore, museums are global. Museum of Modern Art doesn't serve people of the United States, it serves everybody. Right? This is how they're defining. This is how these individuals are defining their museum. Museums are agents in the development of culture, whose mission is to foster knowledge by a continuous process of reinterpretation. And here, presumably, reinterpretation from the particular to the general, from the local to the global. In other words, you take something from Hungary and you place it within the context of the global. This is language. This is legal language. Is the treaties legal? Everybody signed it. Anyway, this is language that is already being mobilized, and as people sat down and hammered it out. I don't know the full background. Anybody know what led to the felt need to produce this document? The Elgin marbles, yeah.
That's what it sounds like.
Okay, but basically the argument here is that
Repatriation, that's the intent.
that museums of this type, But also, look, I named a bunch of others. I mean, there are various different types. These museums are not national because they belong to all of us. They belong to a global citizenry. I think that's the ultimate. And then, you know, if it is about, if it is about restitution issues, okay, the Elgin marbles, what's going on? They don't want to return the Elgin marbles to the nation that they came from because they belong to everybody now, right? So it's all, this is the dynamic of the global museum, though, and this is also the problems. Within that dynamic, you also have the problems of, is it right, isn't it right? Is it true that this belongs to everybody? I mean, who does this museum, since we're in MoMA, belong to? Or who does any of these museums belong to? So maybe we'll leave it at that. I think that's opened up a couple of issues.